The humanists in the Renaissance, the manuscripts that they read were actually translated or transcribed during the Carolingian Renaissance.
Thank you for watching Where the Past Lives. I'm your host, Brandon Foster. Where the Past Lives is dedicated to bringing history to life however possible. If you love history, especially medieval history, then this is a place for you. Support my work by liking and subscribing. You can also financially support my work through the link below. Thank you and enjoy the show.
Brandon? Yes, Brandon. What is the Carolingian Renaissance? Well, the Carolingian Renaissance was a period in which culture and particularly education were revived for the express purpose of reforming, or rather rectifying, the way the church worked and the way the Christian people lived. The Carolingian Renaissance was a period under Charlemagne's rule. It ended shortly after him, but during his rule from somewhere about the 780s-ish, all the way up into his death shortly after, dipped after him, and then started ending, especially once the civil war between Charlemagne's grandsons occurred. But it was this idea that the monks were not being taught Latin correctly. They had a very vulgar version of Latin, and he wanted to rectify that. He searched all of Europe. This was a inter-European concept, inter-European thing. You had people from England, like Alcuin. You had someone from Lombardy. He was a Lombard, which was Peter. You had people from Franklin, the Franks. You had people from all over the place, and they all met and started coming to Charlemagne's court because he was the cultural, artistic, and intellectual magnet. Anyone who was anyone in Europe was starting to gravitate towards Aachen by this point and Charlemagne. It used to be going to Constantinople, but Constantinople was having a lot of problems at that time. You had Empress Irene was in charge, and she had just killed her son and did all these crazy things. So Constantinople was struggling. You did have over on the other side in Arabia, you had Baghdad and Harun al-Rashid, and that was a huge magnet. But if you're in Europe, if you're in Christendom, you're not necessarily going to go to the Islamic Caliph. Some did, but you're not really going to go to that. You're going to go to largest Christian king. So that was Charlemagne. So everyone was coming to Charlemagne, especially Alcuin, who I've already mentioned. He was a student under Bede, who was in England, and so he was just intellectual of intellectuals at that time. And he, under Charlemagne's directions and Charlemagne's funding, was able to make something called the palace schools. This kind of intellectual hub around Charlemagne and his family. So his daughters were educated, his sons were educated, the men of the court were educated, and all these people, and they were supposed to then take that and kind of disperse it down. Charlemagne decreed that children across the entire empire were supposed to be educated. Didn't really happen, but he decreed it. He wanted it to happen. And the sole purpose was so that people could become more Christian. They wanted the monks to be able to write better, to transcribe better. This was the revival of transcribing. And a lot of the humanists in the Reformation and Renaissance, or Renaissance and Reformation, the manuscripts that they read were actually translated or transcribed during the Carolingian Renaissance. So some of that dark age belief that they held, that nothing happened between 476 and 1000, or even up to 1200, 1300, 1400, the dark ages at that period when they believed it was, they were reading things transcribed during that time. And the only reason why they had them was because of the work done by, at that time, the scholars, what that time, that period's scholastic work was. And so this Carolingian Renaissance had a revival of learning for transcribing the Bible, transcribing works from antiquity. It also had a revival of architecture and art. And no, it was not Roman-styled art by this point. Charlemagne died in 814. By this time, it had transitioned into something else. It looked different. Doesn't make it any less artistic, but it just looked different. It wasn't the same as the height of the Roman world. Of course, it was going to be different. And there are art critics and ways of describing whether it was better or not, but that's not the point of this video. So the Carolingian Renaissance was a short-lived period within the Carolingian dynasty, primarily with Charlemagne, and it focused on monastic transcribing and learning, though there was also the intellectual learning of the court, and it was meant to create this atmosphere of intellectualism. So around the table, they would have poems read. Charlemagne's favorite book was City of God by Augustine, and he would have it read. He would have writing, and one of of the biggest things that came from it, outside of this rebirth of transcription, was the Carolingian minuscule. Writing that we have today, the forms that we write, actually was birthed during this period. So minuscule, lowercase letters. That's a big thing. So Roman script up to this point only wrote in capital letters, or primarily wrote in capital letters. It also had no punctuation, and it had nothing else. It was very confusing. There was no spaces. That's why you have like these long transcriptions, and you have to know how to read it to read it. With the advent of lower cases, punctuations, capital letters, stuff like that, it was easier to read and much easier to write. And it's a whole lot prettier to look at. If you look at the manuscripts starting from this point on, they start having that medieval look to them. They no longer have the Roman look about them. So that was one of the biggest things that Alcuin and his monks and other intellectuals of the time kind of finalized. I think it was starting before then. They didn't like start it, complete it, but they finalized it and perfected it during this time. So the Carolingian Renaissance, it was very small, but it was incredibly important. And even though some parts of it didn't last, the waves lasted the centuries and still reaches us today. So that is what the Carolingian Renaissance is.